They called him Mr. Warmth, the undisputed king of insult comedy, a man who could roast anyone from Hollywood royalty to sitting presidents and still leave them doubled over in laughter. His timing was razor sharp, his wit unmatched, and his charm irresistible. But behind the spotlight and the standing ovations was a single, unforgettable moment in Don Rickles' career, one that didn't end with a laugh, but with a silence so deep it would echo for years. In his final years, Don Rickles shared a story he had kept locked away for decades, a night so tense, so draining, that it carved a scar deep enough to last a lifetime. It unfolded on the set of one of the most iconic films of the 1990s, under blinding lights, with cameras rolling well past midnight and Hollywood legends just steps away. But this wasn't about the glamour of show business or the lure of a big paycheck. This was about egos colliding, patience shattering, and a line being crossed so sharply that Rickles made a decision he would never reverse. For a man whose humor could diffuse almost any situation, this time there was no punchline, only silence and a quiet exit. The name at the center of it all. That's where the real intrigue begins. It started like any other high-stakes production, enormous budget, powerhouse cast, and sky-high expectations. Rickles, already cemented as a comedy legend, had been invited to deliver a small yet unforgettable role in Casino. But for him, it would become far more than just another credit on his resume. It would be the set where laughter died and respect was tested beyond repair. It was an opportunity for him to step out of his comedic comfort zone and immerse himself in the gritty, intricately designed universe of Martin Scorsese's mob epic. For Rickles, this was a unique chance to share the screen with the titans of dramatic cinema and infuse his own distinctive flair into a project that was bound for greatness. He held a deep appreciation for the craft, the intricacies, and the relentless passion that went into creating something exceptional. However, that appreciation was about to be challenged in ways he never anticipated. The set hummed with precision. Scorsese was like a maestro, expertly directing every movement, every glance, every pause with meticulous precision. He was the type of director who would reshoot a scene 10, 20, or even 30 times, in pursuit of that elusive perfect moment, much like a gold prospector searching for treasure. For actors like Robert De Niro, who were methodical and fully dedicated to embodying their roles, this process was not just routine, it was exhilarating. Each additional take presented a chance to refine their performance and delve deeper into their characters. For Rickles, however, it was an entirely different experience. He thrived on immediacy. His realm was live performance. The thrill of an audience erupting in laughter just moments after he delivered a punchline. The exhilarating unpredictability of a moment that could never be replicated. Endless retakes under harsh, unchanging lights felt like a slow form of torture. It was a kind of artistic limbo where the energy of the room diminished with each take. The tipping point arrived during a grueling night shoot in Las Vegas. Hours past midnight, the once glamorous casino floor had become stale and oppressive, thick with cigarette smoke, while the faint sound of slot machines continued to echo in the background. Extras slumped in exhaustion between takes. The crew moved like phantoms, quietly adjusting lights and cameras. Rickles, who typically lifted everyone's spirits, was unusually quiet, his humor stifled by the relentless pace. De Niro was fully immersed in his method acting. He was so focused that he hardly spoke unless the camera rolled. Each take turned into a new surgical precision study. Even seasoned crew members had to tread gingerly because of the repeated movements, the tone of the lines, and the focused gaze. For Rickles, it felt like he was stuck in an endless cycle. By 4 a.m., patience was running low. Both physical and mental exhaustion were present. A grating feeling that they were repeatedly circling the same spot. Determining to get it perfect, Scorsese called for one more take, then another, and still another. Finally, though, Rickles said to himself, loud enough for those around him to hear, "Marty, if we keep going at this pace, we'll still be here." Some team members suppressed tense laughter when they demolished the building. De Niro remained motionless and unresponsive. The room's atmosphere seemed to constrict. The guy who could roast a president without flinching, Don Rickles, felt the weight of a moment without a safe punchline for the first time in his career. After delivering his lines one final time and hitting his mark, he left the set with his eyes fixed straight ahead and his face taut. No parting joke, no wink, no wave. He would come clean later. He would never again labor with such intensity. The humorless intensity, the underlying tension, and the plodding, oppressive pace. It would take years for the individual at the center of that world to realize that he didn't belong there. And even his closest friends would be in disbelief when it happened. Silence was the enemy to someone like Don Rickles. Rapid-fire banter, the skill of delivering a punchline to an audience before they had a chance to catch their breath, had been the foundation of his entire career. He flourished in environments that were chaotic, noisy, and full of opportunities for jokes. But it wasn't simply awkward silence on the casino set. It was oppressive. It encircled the space like a thick blanket, suppressing all of the urges to talk, laugh, and decompress. The focal point of that silence was Robert Dyro. He spoke only when he had to, since he was locked deep within his character. Even so, he spoke in a controlled and purposeful manner. You might sense as though you were being examined, weighed, and discreetly filed away because of the unwavering intensity in his gaze. Every action was planned, every pause purposeful. This was genius in action for the players and staff. A craftsman in his field. However, Rickles compared it to waiting for a coiled spring to snap while standing next to it. Ego was not the source of the friction. Not initially. It had to do with rhythm. Moreover, Rickles was fluent in rhythm. Comedy moves quickly. They laugh, you toss the line, and you continue. Drama could be glacial, particularly in the Scorsese-Dyro vein. Each scene was broken down, examined, and reenacted in slow, methodical rhythms. As if saving his energy for the following shot, Dyro would withdraw to a quiet spot in between takes, sometimes going over his notes and other times just sitting still. In the meantime, Rickles would look around the room for someone to make fun of, someone to tease, anyone to prevent the weight from consuming him completely. However, the air was too dense. Even the staff, who are usually quick to joke around during downtime, spoke quietly and moved carefully. They all appeared to be cautiously avoiding the invisible bubble that the star and director had constructed, fearing that it would burst. Rickles ultimately made the decision to try to ease the strain one evening during yet another long shoot. Rickles smiled and remarked, "Bobby, you've got the personality of a parking meter," as Dyro stood close by, his eyes locked on somewhere far away, deep in meditation. "If you give me a quarter, I might smile." A couple grips giggled to themselves, dipping their heads to hide their laughter. Dyro remained motionless, did not blink, and did not even adjust his weight. The sting of a joke dying in the air was something Rickles had never experienced on a stage before, and his stillness was almost uncanny. It was only that there was no space for it to live, not because it wasn't hilarious. The remainder of the shoot appeared to drag on forever after that, with constant pauses, camera resets, and a slow, simmering energy that made time seem to drag on forever. Rickles performed his duties, hit his targets, and refrained from speaking when the need to jest surfaced. On the inside, however, he had already decided. He would never again work in a setting that stifled the very thing that made him who he was, regardless of how well the film did or how famous the actors and crew were. Rickles didn't discuss it in public, though. Not for years, not then. The way a card shark conceals an ace until it's time to play it, he hid the recollection. And the business didn't merely listen when he eventually disclosed who had driven him to that breaking point. It leaned in. Additionally, the subsequent murmurs were nearly as heavy as the initial hush. Don Rickles held on to that memory for decades like a tightly sealed briefcase that was never opened in public. He had made a living by making people laugh while concealing some realities behind his quick wit and incisive jokes. Fans and friends recognized him as the guy who could strike out mercilessly and still be loved. It's uncommon for a performer to take a standing ovation after roasting a superstar. However, his closest friends and co-workers suspected that there were parts of his life he would want not be known about. Among them was Casino. The years passed quickly, filled with red carpet events, sold-out performances, and late-night appearances. Each interview featured Rickles' signature quips and anecdotes that skirted the boundaries of more profound realities. He would smirk, crack a safe joke, and divert the discussion whenever someone inquired about his challenging experiences in Hollywood. The name of the individual or people who had ruined the experience was never mentioned by him. The seal didn't completely break until he was far into his twilight years. It took place in a modest location, away from the spotlight of network television. During a brief, private interview, Rickles sat on a padded armchair. No crowd, no thunderous laughing to break the silence. Seeing an opportunity, the host inquired about the most difficult set he had ever worked on. Most people anticipated him to respond to the question with a joke. Perhaps a joke about a claustrophobic trailer, a heavy-handed makeup artist, or a subpar lunch spread. Rickles hesitated instead. He didn't employ his typical comedic beat before a punchline. It was longer enough for everyone in the room to lean forward, heavier, slower, and more purposeful. "You know, I loved Casino, but I wouldn't work with Dyro again, or _CI for that matter," he replied with a disarming serenity. "Not in that manner. Never." The word struck like a clap of thunder. There was no roast here. This was no trivial detail. It was authentic. Rickles continued by describing the never-ending retakes, the oppressive environment, and how Dyro's unflinching earnestness formed a barrier that no one could penetrate. He acknowledged that he is a fantastic actor, and I admire him, but his performance left me exhausted. It was remarkable for Rickles, a man who had sparred with Johnny Carson, charmed Eastwood, and swapped lines with Sinatra, to single out one partnership as the deal-breaker. He wasn't trying to make it funny. He didn't embellish or vent. After years of courteous half-answers, he talked as if he was finally sick of bearing the burden, telling the truth the way you might to an old friend. As usual, he couldn't help but smirk as he concluded the tale. He had the kind of expression that left you wondering if he was being serious or if he was just playing around. Since you could never be really certain with Rickles, that moment of uncertainty just served to heighten the shock of the revelation. However, one thing was for sure. It was impossible to retract such statements once they were spoken. And that silent confession left a shockwave that never went away. After the cameras finished filming, it reverberated across Hollywood for months, being discussed in industry lunches, whispered in green rooms, and spread like a piece of unstoppable rumors that nobody could quite believe originated from Mr. Warm-Up himself. Don Rickles' quiet but incisive statement didn't simply fade away into the cacophony of celebrity rumors, rather, it remained. Those who had spent years working with him were taken aback. This was a man who flourished in an environment full of the biggest egos in industry and who could take Frank Sinatra to his face. He never forgot it, though, because this one movie had left such a deep scar. It was made even more thrilling by the fact that he mentioned Martin Scorsese and Robert Dyro simultaneously. Hollywood insiders started exchanging their own stories behind closed doors. Some gave knowing nods. Scorsese's sets were notoriously demanding, after all. His vision needed to be precise, even down to the slightest eyelid movement. Some were more taken aback. Rickles? Really? The man who could deal with anyone? During a Beverly Hills lunch, one director is said to have said, the disbelief wasn't about if it happened. It was about who was affected. Working with Dyro was a rite of passage for a few actors. Because that's what created excellence on screen, you embraced the focus, the silence, and the intensity. However, Rickles had attended a different performance school. He relished on the erratic back and forth that kept energy electrifying, as well as the rhythm of a live audience. He felt as though he was confined by the ordered quiet that replaced that current. After his remarks went viral, casting directors and agents started analyzing the underlying meaning. Was Rickles silently criticizing the way of acting? Was respect at issue? Or was it just the collision of two completely different worlds in a single, high-pressure setting? Nobody knew for sure, and Rickles showed little interest in providing an explanation. He let the stone fall into the pond. Everyone else's business was affected. The narrative took on a life of its own in certain circles. It turned become a whispered warning to budding comedians making their first foray into the world of movies. Don't count on the legends to make things simple. Veterans of the industry also engaged in secret discussions about it. Was Dairo's strategy brilliant or a barrier that prevented cooperation? Meanwhile, Rickles continued to be charming as always. Still making jokes on late-night television and entertaining large crowds. However, his smile would tighten somewhat if the topic of casino was ever brought up, as though he were recalling that long night in Las Vegas when not even the comedy king could find anything funny. Despite the impact of the news, there was one last twist. Rickles only revealed this information when pressed, and it added to the strangeness of the whole tale. The incident took place during one of Don Rickles' latter interviews, the type where the lighting is softer, the cameras are smaller, and the questioning stray into areas that most shows never go. Was it personal, or was it just the atmosphere on set? The presenter questioned, leaning forward and obviously enthralled with the casino story. Rickles shrugged slowly and for a long time, the kind of shrug that says more than words. Let's just say, there was one night I realized I didn't belong there, he remarked, with his signature smile. Not in that setting, not in that state of mind. He described how he had been waiting off to the side during a particularly lengthy shot as Dairo and Scorsese argued over the smallest detail of a scene, a almost perceptible hand flick. They spent about 40 minutes pacing back and forth. Ever the live performer, Rickles was agitated. At last, he said, "I'll need a wheelchair before we wrap at this rate, guys." No one chuckled. Not the crew, not Scorsese, not Dairo. The heavy air in the room seemed to have swallowed the humor. Later on, Rickles acknowledged that was the pivotal time in his life. It was no longer his stage if a set could be so serious that even a well-timed wise remark would die on hit. His admission that he never saw the entire movie after it came out was what most startled fans. Fantastic film. I've heard that during one of his last specials, he made a joke. I simply omitted my scenes. I didn't want to go through the restless nights again. The audience roared, but the truth was hidden below the laughter. He still remembered the incident, but not in a positive, sentimental sense. Rickles never openly disparaged Dairo or Scorsese in a town where destroying bridges can ruin careers. However, it was a silent act of resistance for him to even briefly discuss why he would never again collaborate with them. Retaliation wasn't the point. It was about setting a boundary and sticking to it, even in old age. That marked the unusual, almost bittersweet conclusion to the tale of one of Hollywood's most surprising behind-the-scenes conflicts. Or so it appeared. Because even this chapter kept readers wondering if the joke was coming, in typical Don Rickles fashion. Don Rickles' epiphany ultimately went beyond a horrible night on the set of a movie. It has to do with the type of performer he was and the type he declined to become. Over the course of his 6-decade career, he had met television, movie, and music giants. He'd sparred with Sinatra, teased Johnny Carson into tears, and decreased audiences of heaps to helpless laughter. Via it all, Rickles thrived on connection, instant, unpredictable, and alive. That is what fueled him. That is what kept him sharp. So while Casino came along, it seemed like the right cherry on top of an already mythical resume. But rather than the pleasure of collaboration, Rickles found himself in a global wherein precision replaced spontaneity, where the laughter became left on the door. It wasn't incorrect. It simply wasn't him. And for a person who had constructed an existence on authenticity, that became a deal breaker. In his later years, he spoke more approximately the significance of defense of your very own fashion, your own spark. He in no way trashed Dairo or Scorsese. In truth, he called them extremely good extra than once. But he changed into clean. Brilliance doesn't continually suggest compatibility. Even the best abilities can conflict, no longer out of animosity, but out of natural irreconcilable distinction in how they see the paintings. What made his admission so striking changed into how uncommon it became for him to interrupt the illusion. Rickles changed into a showman to the middle. He knew when to turn a real grievance into fun and while to hold a tale in the vault, that he selected to share this one in any respect intended it had honestly left a mark. But, real to shape, he never permit the tale end without a twist. Occasionally while asked about that notorious night time, he'd lean in and whisper, "Perhaps I made the whole lot up simply to maintain you guessing." Nobody ever knew if he meant it. That turned into Rickles's magic. Even when he told the truth, he made certain you walked away questioning. So the man who spent his life making the sector snort behind not just jokes, however puzzles, became his in no way once more approximately Dyro, approximately Scorsese, or was it ultimately approximately himself? Quietly choosing where his strength belonged. We might also never realize for certain. And that is precisely how Don Rickles could have desired it, because the excellent punchlines are the ones you're still thinking about long after the curtain falls.